The United States is single-handedly standing in the way to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state. On the 18th of April, there was a vote in the United Nations Security Council that called for Palestine to be admitted as a UN member state. And there was one country on the 15-member Security Council that voted against the resolution, the United States. And the US has veto power, meaning that Washington was able to prevent the Security Council from recommending that Palestine becomes a member state. And this means that the UN General Assembly, which has 193 member states, is not able to have a vote. So the vast majority of the world, which recognizes Palestine as a state, does not have a voice. They have been silenced because the United States is holding the entire world hostage, blocking the UN from recognizing Palestine. This is the fifth time since October that the US has used its veto power in order to sabotage a resolution in the Security Council that was related to Gaza. In the other four cases, the US blocked proposals of ceasefires and peace that tried to save Palestinian lives, while Israel is using large numbers of US weapons to kill Palestinian civilians trapped in the besieged Gaza Strip. And while this is happening, with staunch US support, Israel is expanding its war on Gaza into a regional war, and Israel is repeatedly attacking Iran. This was confirmed by US government officials who spoke with CNN, and they revealed that Israel actually gave advanced notification to the United States on Thursday, the 18th of April, when it was making its plans to attack Iran. The US knew that Israel was going to attack Iran, and on the same day, the US at the UN Security Council vetoed a resolution that called to recognize Palestine. Now, the Joe Biden administration claims that it supposedly does not want this war to continue to expand, and it supposedly told Israel it does not support its attack on Iran. But this is complete propaganda. Just because the US government says something doesn't mean it actually means it, because in reality, you have to look at what the US government does and not simply what it says. And if you look at the actions of the Biden administration, it has continued supporting Israel 100%, giving it weapons as it continues to expand this war. After all, it was Israel that started this new phase of the war back on the 1st of April when Israel attacked Iran's embassy in Syria, killing top military officials. This was an act of war against Iran. In response to that, the US government ordered Iran not to respond in self-defense, lecturing Iran. Then on the 3rd of April, the US blocked a proposal in the Security Council that would have condemned the attack on the Iranian embassy in Syria. So the US was protecting Israel once again at the Security Council. And then the US showed its blatant double standards, and it demanded hypocritically that the Security Council condemn Iran for attacking Israel in self-defense after Israel attacked Iran first, and after the US prevented the Security Council from condemning Israel for carrying out this act of war against Iran. And then the cherry on top of the hypocrisy is the Biden administration imposed more sanctions on Iran after Iran, which had a right under international law to act in self-defense, carried out a counterattack against Israel in response to Israel's first attack on its embassy. The US did not condemn that. The US told the world to condemn Iran, and then the US put sanctions on Iran for defending itself. So at every single stage here, we can see how the US is blocking peace in the Security Council, is arming Israel as it's bombing women and children trapped in Gaza, and then the US is supporting Israel 100% as it bombs Iran and expands this into a regional war. The US is dragging the world into World War III, and then they're blaming Iran. And meanwhile, in the middle of all of this, the US is openly preventing the recognition of Palestine as a member of the United Nations. And I'm reading here from the UN News Agency. They published a newswire on the 18th of April that is titled "U.S. Vetoes Palestine's Request for Full UN Membership." And this article notes that of the 15 countries on the UN Security Council, 12 countries voted in support of this resolution, including China and Russia, and France also voted in support of it. One country vetoed it, the US, and 2 countries abstained. Those were the UK and Switzerland. And of course, Britain goes along with the US and basically does whatever it wants. And in fact, let's not forget, it was in fact the British Empire that colonized Palestine, and it was the British Empire that gave its blessing to the creation of Israel as a colonial project back in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration, in which the British Empire said that it would support the creation of this colonial entity through the colonization of the indigenous Palestinian population. And then, of course, later, the US Empire absorbed much of the British Empire after World War II, and the US Empire has continued this colonial project started by the British Empire. And fast forward to today, and we see how the Anglo-American colonial axis continues to oppress the Palestinian people and deny them their inalienable rights to having political representation and a state of their own, which are written into international law. Now, this article at the UN News website pointed out that the resolution that the US vetoed was one of the shortest Security Council resolutions in the history of the body, going back to 1945. All it said was the Security Council, having examined the application of the State of Palestine for admission to the United Nations, recommends to the General Assembly that the State of Palestine be admitted to membership in the United Nations. That's it. Very simple. And in order for a country to be recognized as a member state of the UN, the Security Council has to approve it in order to later go to the General Assembly for a vote where the world can vote, the 193 member states in the world. But of course, the US has veto power at the Security Council because the US helped to create the United Nations, and the US basically refuses to be part of any international political body unless it has veto power. This is the so-called rules-based international order in which the US makes the rules and orders everyone else around. Now, this UN News report pointed out that back in 2011, Palestine officially requested to become a UN member state, and in 2012, Palestine was voted to be a permanent observer of the UN, meaning that the UN officially recognizes it, but it's not officially a member state, which means that Palestine cannot vote on UN General Assembly resolutions. And it should not surprise you to learn that back in 2012, when the General Assembly voted on this resolution that recognized Palestine as a non-member observer state, 138 out of the 193 member states, the vast majority of the world, voted in support of Palestine, and only 9 countries voted against recognizing Palestine as a non-member observer state. And can you guess what those countries were? The United States, Canada, the Czech Republic, Panama, Israel itself, and the tiny island nations of Micronesia, Marshall Islands, Nauru, and Palau. So it was North America and a bunch of US client regimes that voted against the vast majority of the world in opposing recognizing Palestine as simply an observer state, not even a member. In fact, 140 out of the 193 member states, roughly 3/4 of the world's countries, officially have diplomatic relations with the state of Palestine. They recognize Palestine as a state, but the United Nations does not. And why? Because of the United States. If you look at a map of the countries that recognize Palestine as a state, I mean, it says everything. It's the global South and Russia, the global majority that recognize Palestine, and it's the Western colonial powers, the US, Canada, Western Europe, Australia, and also Japan and South Korea. They are the colonial powers that refuse to recognize Palestine, and it's specifically Washington that is holding the entire world hostage and preventing the Palestinian people from ever having their political rights realized on the international stage. This is modern day colonialism. It is continued by the same colonial powers that colonized the vast majority of the world, and they still treat the world as their colonial property, and they preach their beloved so-called rules-based international order, again, in which the West makes the rules and orders everyone else around. And this shows how ridiculous it is whenever the US government claims that it supports a so-called two-state solution. Every single US president for decades, Republican or Democrat, has always repeated this fake doctrine, this mantra that they've never actually believed in. Joe Biden has said dozens of times that we support a so-called two-state solution whenever he meets with Israeli officials. Back in November, Biden claimed a two-state solution is the only way to guarantee the long-term security of both the Israeli and the Palestinian people. In October, he talked about his trip to Israel and he said, we cannot give up on a two-state solution. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has also claimed dozens of times that supposedly the U.S. supports a so-called two-state solution. He's constantly meeting with top Israeli officials and repeating this doctrine. But when it actually comes to voting at the UN, the US always opposes calls for the creation of a Palestinian state. This is exactly why I said earlier, it doesn't matter what the US government says. It doesn't matter if the Biden administration says that it's angry at Netanyahu and says it supposedly criticized Netanyahu in a phone call one time. It doesn't matter what it says. It matters what the US government does. And we have seen again and again and again and again and again over decades under both Republican and Democratic presidents, the US government has always opposed the creation of a Palestinian state and always supported the most extreme, far-right, maximalist demands in Israel for full colonization of historic Palestine. The renowned historian Rashid Khalidi at Columbia University has shown in his book, Brokers of Deceit, how the U.S. has undermined peace in the Middle East, how Washington always opposed the creation of a Palestinian state, and Washington has always prevented peace in Israel-Palestine. He begins the book referring to U.S. officials as dishonest brokers, and Rashid Khalidi wrote that an American brokered political process has for more than 35 years reinforced the subjugation of the Palestinian people, provided Israel and the United States with a variety of advantages, and made considerably more unlikely the prospects of a just and lasting settlement of the conflict between Israel and the Arabs. Now, this book was published in 2014, so it's a decade old, but everything that he wrote about is even more true today. Professor Khalidi wrote that, quote, the policy of the United States toward the Palestine question has actually functioned to exacerbate rather than resolve this problem. He detailed how central the support of the United States was for the enduring system of control of the millions of Palestinians living under military occupation, a system that was conceived, constructed, and maintained by Israel. That's a quote. And he added that, quote, the incessantly repeated American mantra, whether in official statements or writing, that is policy-oriented, academic, or journalistic about a so-called peace process has served to disguise an ugly reality. Whatever process the United States was championing, it was not, in fact, actually directed at achieving a just and lasting peace between Palestinians and Israelis. Instead of trying to achieve these goals, Khalidi wrote, the process actually undertaken by the United States was aimed primarily at pressuring the weaker Palestinians into conforming to the desiderata of their much stronger oppressor, Israel. The US government does not support peace in Palestine. The US government does not oppose Israel's war in Gaza and its attempt to start a war on Iran. The US does not want Palestinians to have a state recognized under international law. It doesn't matter what Joe Biden says, what Antony Blinken, what Donald Trump says, George Bush. This has been a consistent policy going back decades. This is the reality of the US empire. The US is not a normal country. It is an empire, and it talks about itself as the world policeman, but in reality, it's not a policeman. It is a global dictator. The US sees itself as the dictator of the world. That's why the US is constantly trying to impose its own laws on other countries. It's why it's trying to imprison Julian Assange, an Australian journalist who has never lived in the US. It is trying to imprison him in the US for supposedly violating US laws, for doing the so-called crime of journalism. It's why the US sanctions other countries for violating its illegal unilateral sanctions that it imposes on the rest of the world. And we can see this so clearly at the United Nations, where the US is constantly opposing the will of the entire world, excluding the 13% of the population in the West. Now, the United Nations has a very interesting website where you can see all of the times that members of the Security Council have used their veto throughout history. And you can see that dozens of times the US has used veto power in order to block resolutions in the Security Council that had to do with Israel, Palestine. If the consequences weren't so deadly, it would almost be funny. I mean, just looking at how ridiculous it is, at how many times the US has used its veto power in order to protect Israel at the Security Council, because Israel, again, is an extension of the US empire. That's why the US continues to prevent the creation of a Palestinian state, or at least a recognition of a Palestinian state, and always shield Israel. However, there's another very important thing that you should draw from this if you analyze these US vetoes. And you can see that only some of them involve Israel, but the US has also frequently used its veto on the Security Council in order to protect white supremacist colonialist settler regimes in Africa. In fact, as the New York Times reported back in 1970, the first time the US ever used its veto in the Security Council was in order to protect the white supremacist settler colonial regime in Rhodesia that was named after the British colonialist Cecil Rhodes, a diamond magnate. And he, by the way, had also been in correspondence with the colonialist Theodore Herzl, who wanted to create the State of Israel as a settler colonial project and was seeking the support of the British Empire in order to create Israel. Well, going back to Rhodesia, the US joined the British Empire in supporting these white supremacist apartheid regimes in southern Africa. And if you look at the list of US vetoes in the Security Council in the 1970s going into the 80s, you can see that many of them involve the US vetoing resolutions that condemned the white supremacist colonialist regimes in South Africa, in what is modern day Namibia, which was being occupied by the South African apartheid regime, and also in Rhodesia. So, I mean, this is the perfect historical symbol of what the US empire represents. For decades, the US was protecting white supremacist settler colonialist regimes in southern Africa, and meanwhile, the US was also protecting the white supremacist settler colonialist apartheid regime in Israel, in historic Palestine, which carries out the exact same practices of apartheid that were carried out in South Africa. Israel carries those out today against the indigenous Palestinian population. This is why leaders of the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, like Desmond Tutu, constantly compared Israel's apartheid to South Africa's apartheid. That's why they constantly supported Palestinians, because they could see that they were going through very similar colonialist processes of oppression by some of the same colonial powers. Let's not forget that the British Empire also was involved in the colonization of South Africa after the Dutch Empire. And it's why the first ever leader of South Africa after ending apartheid, Nelson Mandela, famously said that without the liberation of the Palestinian people, we are not free. It's why still today, the South African government continues to support the Palestinian people. It's why the South African government took Israel to The Hague, the International Court of Justice, and charged it with the G crime, which I'm not going to say because of the possibility of this video being demonetized. But it's why South Africa has been taking action against the Israeli apartheid regime, because there is so much in common between what they suffered and what the Palestinian people are suffering today. And the common thread is also the US empire's staunch, unflinching support for Israeli apartheid and South African apartheid. In fact, the CIA helped the South African apartheid regime imprison Nelson Mandela in 1962. He was imprisoned for 27 years for the so-called crime of opposing apartheid and colonialism. He was tortured with US support. And today we see the exact same thing. This is not new. This is what the US empire has always been. This is the real face of US imperialism. US politicians talk about human rights and democracy and rule of law and all this nonsense. They do not actually believe in it. It is all diplomatic cover. It is all a fig leaf for the neo-colonialist policies that they carry out around the world in order to protect the wealth of a small handful of capitalist oligarchs, to exploit the majority of the world in the global south. This is what the US empire is actually dedicated to preserving the wealth of this small handful of capitalist oligarchs. But anyway, getting back to the main issue of Palestine, which of course is central in all of these issues of imperialism, we should go back and look at this US veto in the Security Council against recognizing Palestine as a member state. And if we go back to this UN news wire, there are some very revealing comments that were made by the Russian and Chinese delegations. In his statements, China's ambassador to the UN said the decades-long dream of the Palestinian people has been quashed at a time when the admission of Palestine as a full member of the UN is more urgent than ever before. He said the establishment of an independent state is an inalienable right that cannot be questioned. China has been very outspoken in support of Palestine. In fact, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in Indonesia on the 18th of April, right before this vote happened in the Security Council. And Indonesia's Foreign Minister had a press conference with Wang Yi, and both of them called on the world to recognize Palestine. They called on the Security Council to allow the UN to admit Palestine as a member state. They also called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. And Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, made some very heated comments here criticizing the hypocrisy of the United States. He condemned the US for claiming that UN Security Council resolutions are non-binding. He said the world was shocked by this claim. He said this shows that to the US, international law is only a tool that they use as they want. He said, I believe American government officials should learn basic knowledge, criticizing the ignorance and hypocrisy of the US. And he also added that the US government should put aside its ego. And of course, Indonesia has historically been a strong supporter of the Palestinian cause, and its government made very similar comments. But also, if we go back to the UN News report, we can see that at the Security Council session, Russia was quite outspoken in support of Palestine as well. Russia's ambassador to the UN said that the US once again demonstrated what they really think of the Palestinians. For Washington, the Palestinians do not deserve to have their own state. They are only a barrier on the path toward realizing the interests of Israel. He said the absolute majority of the global community supports Palestine's application to become a full member of the UN. And the Russian ambassador said, today's use of the veto by the US delegation is a hopeless attempt to stop the inevitable course of history. The results of the vote, where Washington was practically in complete isolation, speak for themselves. And the representative from Russia pointed out, this was the 5th time the US has vetoed a Security Council resolution since the current war in Gaza. In February, the US vetoed a resolution that was introduced by Algeria that called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. In December, the US vetoed a resolution that was introduced by the United Arab Emirates that also called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. On the 18th of October, the US vetoed another resolution that had been introduced by Brazil, and this was actually a weaker resolution. All it called for was humanitarian pauses to deliver life-saving aid to millions in Gaza. The US vetoed that as well. And 2 days before that, on the 16th of October, the US voted against a resolution that was introduced by Russia that called for a humanitarian ceasefire. And in that case, France and Japan and the UK, the other colonial powers, joined the US in voting against this resolution calling for peace in Gaza. And after doing all of that, this March, the US pulled another ridiculous political stunt in which the US abstained in a Security Council resolution that called for a ceasefire in Gaza, but only during the month of Ramadan. So not a permanent ceasefire, only during the month of Ramadan. And after this resolution was passed in the Security Council, then the US representative, Linda Thomas Greenfield, she claimed that the Security Council resolution was, quote, non-binding, which is false. According to Article 25 of the UN Charter, all members of the United Nations have to carry out the decisions of the Security Council. Its resolutions are indeed binding under international law. So the US was trying to rewrite international law in order to protect Israel as it was bombing Gaza, and simply in order to prevent the implementation of a resolution that only called for a temporary ceasefire during the month of Ramadan, which Israel ignored anyway, and the US continued to give Israel weapons while it ignored the Security Council resolution. And of course, the US has also been staunchly supporting Israel and sending him more weapons, as Israel blatantly violates a ruling by the International Court of Justice at The Hague, the top legal authority of the UN, the top legal authority in the world. And the court said very clearly that Israel could be investigated for violating the Convention on the G crime, the worst crime that a country could commit. I'm not going to say that word, so this is not demonetized here, because there's been a lot of censorship for people talking about that. Israel is violating that ICJ ruling, while UN experts are publicly saying that Israel is committing the G crime in Gaza. Israel is carrying out crimes against humanity. The US government is arming it and strongly supporting it. The Biden administration claims that he doesn't want more war while he continues to give Netanyahu weapons to carry out that war. And now Israel's expanding that war, waging war in Iran as well. And the US is preventing the United Nations from recognizing Palestine as a member state. Quite literally, the US is the world's biggest obstacle to world peace. That is not an exaggeration. The United States government, the US empire, is the biggest obstacle to world peace, period. If you've learned anything since this horrific war started in October, that should be one of the most important lessons that you take away. On that note, I'm going to conclude here. I'm Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe, help to promote our work. And I will be back soon reporting more on the latest geopolitical and economic developments in the world today. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.